is academic comeback. Very easy, to be honest. If you're getting a free about revision, a bit of revision, you'll be surprised what you could actually do. Right, Elizabeth today, everyone. I'm not doing Hardwick Hall because that's paper 2. Hardwick Hall's paper 2 for AQA, so there will be some Hardwick Hall stuff after paper 1. Okay, all of my main focus point starting Monday is towards paper 1s. There will be time for paper 2 topics. They will be afterwards. Okay. No, we're not having this. We're not having all this negativity, people. We are positive. If I can give up my evenings for you, the least we can do is. Lucy, go and check my TikTok. Go and check the schedule. Okay, it is tailored towards paper 1 at the moment. Yeah, Ruby, both Germany and conflict will be there. OCRB, yeah, they will be useful. If you do Elizabeth, OCRB, you're in the right place. On my link tree, I've got OCRB topics for Nazi Germany, Elizabeth, Making of America. Yep, if I haven't specified an exam board, everyone, this Elizabeth one will be useful for most of you. Elizabeth's Elizabeth. Well done, thank you. Yeah, I've got some really good links for the WJEC stuff in my link tree as well for the Welsh exam board. I've got some good YouTube links for National 5 Scotland. That's in there too. Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, so just going to get myself ready and then we're going to make a start. Unless it's Elizabeth related, people, go and check my link tree on my TikTok today to find out if your topics are going to be covered. I'm going live straight for 3 weeks. Okay, apart from Saturdays because I need a day off. The rest of it, link tree, go and have a look at what we've got going. If that includes exam technique, that does include revision techniques, go to my link tree. I've uploaded all the documents I have for you as well. It's all there, you know. Yep, I will do Afia, but that will be the night before exam paper 1. If you're in urgent need, you go to my link tree, you go and sort it out. Right, only Elizabeth today, everyone. No other questions about other things other than Elizabeth because you can go and find out the stuff you need from my TikTok or link tree if you need that. Okay, so it's Elizabeth. Thank you very much for the people who are applying. Help them out. It's GCSE, Mogs, but I would say go to my link tree. I've got some great A-level tutor documents there. Okay, all exam boards welcome for this one. That's right, Kira, but you know what? We need to revise it. Yes, we do need to know rebellions for GCSE, Elizabeth. Okay, right, let's go. Still, oh, thank you very much. Right, can I just say, so this one, right, settings, comments are off. So I will just recap to a lot of you. Now, these revision sheets are really useful, okay? The only thing that may be missing is this sort of end bit of Elizabeth's reign, but I'll cover that when we get close to paper 2. Most of my topics starting on Monday are going to be focusing on paper 1. I do appreciate Elizabeth. I don't know which paper they sit in for all the exam boards, but Elizabeth is Elizabeth. Okay, all you've got to do, guys, is keep liking and sharing. These notes are already on my link tree, okay? They are literally point perfect for Excel. They're nearly perfect for AQA up until the fact that I miss out the last bit. I'm pretty sure they're nearly pretty strong for OCRB. Okay, so, and if you need something more specific afterwards, go to the link tree and download them, save them. Okay, there's no cost behind it. You've just got to, unfortunately, go and hit a link below my TikTok bio. But we should hopefully, by the time paper 1 gets there, I'm hoping people will get into the habit of doing this. Right, Elizabeth. Thank you very much for the roses. That's really kind of you. So, at the top there are nothing too important, but it's some keywords. Keywords that you actually need to know when we do the Elizabeth course. When we talk about different social classes, okay, it's important that you understand them, especially when we talk about things like the yeomen in the countryside. If we refer to the yeomen, we're referring to middle class, I would say equivalent to what we call the middle class. The gentry are the upper class and the nobility are the wealthy landowners. There is a different hierarchy in town, okay, and you have your skilled craftsmen who are probably the equivalent to the yeoman in the countryside as sort of like your middle class area. Your merchants and professionals are your wealthiest, and then obviously you've got your upper class business owners as well. So if you need a recap, they are there. When we talk about government, there are three areas. You've obviously got the Parliament. We know about that, the two houses of Lords, houses of Commons. When we talk about court, it's people who advised, thank you very much for the donut, people who advised Elizabeth, and the Privy Council are nobles who are put in charge of helping govern the country. Now, when Elizabeth comes to power in 1558, what problems does she face? Well, first of all, she's young. And she is inexperienced, okay? We need to understand the background of Elizabeth. Okay, Elizabeth is the daughter from Henry VIII's second marriage to Anne Boleyn. And it's all surrounding controversy because we know that Henry VIII marries Anne Boleyn after breaking away from the church and declaring himself head of the Church of England. So Elizabeth is a Protestant because that's basically how she was brought up. So there is a lot of people in England who oppose Elizabeth as being queen. Okay? Many people believe she was illegitimate. Why? Because they don't believe that Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry was, thank you very much for the roses, was legitimate. They believe that because it wasn't approved by the Pope, it therefore meant that actually that marriage to Anne Boleyn never happened, and therefore Elizabeth is an illegitimate child who has no right to the throne. She also was unmarried, and at the time there was a big question mark over what's going to happen to the Tudor line, the Tudor dynasty. Okay, there was sort of no plan in place for this. There's a bigger problem, I would say, for Elizabeth. It wouldn't have been as much of a problem if she wasn't having to come in to England and take over her half-sister Mary, who died. Mary has come in and had a huge counter-reformation, and Catholicism had been back in England under Mary's rule. So Elizabeth now comes in an even more difficult situation, that there's this massive counter-reformation happening right the way across Europe, meaning it's, not very popular with a lot of people. Financially, the country is struggling, okay? The crown is in £300,000 worth of debt. And the reason is Elizabeth's half-sister Mary had been selling off a lot of the crown's lands. She had borrowed from foreign countries. And when you borrow money from foreign countries, they all want it paid back, and they'll put up their interest rates to ensure they get their money's worth. And finally, the challenges from abroad. The challenges largely come from the dominant countries. Spain are, at this point, probably the most powerful country in Europe, are Catholic. France is Catholic. Scotland, that borders England, is Catholic. Now, Scotland believe that they have, there's an alternative to the throne to Elizabeth, and that comes from Mary, Queen of Scots. Okay? Because Mary, Queen of Scots, is Catholic, it again poses further dangers to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, however, holds herself very well. If you were going to describe her, she's very educated. Okay? She's very charismatic. She stands by her principles. She always said, I was married to my country. God chose her. She's married to her country. She was very strong-minded about that and very strict in the way she did it. And considering that she is a female monarch in a very heavily male-dominant time in things like government, her advisors, etc., she had a very decisive understanding of things like politics, and she was stubborn. Elizabeth often stuck to her ground, was often very resilient in terms of how she fought. And the first thing Elizabeth has to do is try and sort out the issue of religion. Now, this is something that people you've got to understand. I would say the religious settlement is a bit annoying, but we can sort of muddle our way through it. So, what's the situation like in England when Elizabeth takes over regarding religion? We basically have two branches of Christianity. You have the Catholics. Now, England have been Catholic under Elizabeth's half-sister Mary. So the Catholics have quite a lot of power and have previously had a lot of influence. Catholics believe that the Pope is the head of the church and should make the decisions. They believe that services are in Latin, the word of God, and churches should be highly decorated. Majority of Catholics were living in around the north and the west areas of England. Protestants are people who believe about, who basically follow that the head of the church is whoever is ruling the country. They believe that the religious texts and services should be able to be accessed by everybody, and therefore they should be in English. They were quite opposite in terms of it was more about being closer to God, the simplicity of churches, and in terms of what they wear, etc. Whereas Catholics take, sort of the Eucharist very literally, with the bread and wine becoming the body and blood of Christ, Protestants say it was more of a representation. Now, why do we need to understand both of these? To understand Elizabeth's religious settlement, you need to have an idea in your head already about the differences between Catholics and Protestants, and that's really important. There are then a small group of Protestants known as Puritans. Puritans, in short, are very strict Protestants. Okay, they basically believe what Protestants do, but they are much more extreme. No decoration in churches. There should be no bishops or cardinals. Okay, so the divide of the country is you've got a lot of Catholics in the north and the west. In the south and the east, it's largely Protestants. The Puritans are a small group. They make up a small portion of the Protestants, and they're found around the East Anglia, London area. Now, this is quite difficult, okay, because Elizabeth's coming into this as a Protestant monarch. But Elizabeth does want to try and ensure that there is, understanding and there is peace and not this religious conflict in place. Now, the Church of England in society enforced the religious settlement. They would give spiritual and practical advice. They would preach the government's message, and everyone had to pay the church, okay? Everyone had to pay the church a tithe, which is a tax. Now, the religious settlement comes around and in a year after Elizabeth has taken over, okay, in 1559. Now, there's a really easy way, and if you've looked at my Elizabeth playlist on TikTok, you will know that one way I would say is easy to revise is using the word rubs. Okay, rubs is what I use to remind myself of the different parts of Elizabeth's religious settlement. So you've got royal injunctions. Royal injunctions are basically, it's almost like rules and guidelines that the clergy, members of the church, have to do. So, for example, members of the church have to teach royal supremacy. They have to teach or make sure there's an English Bible. They have to report people who don't attend church. So royal injunctions are really simple, okay? They are a set of rules that need to be followed across churches in England. The U in rubs stands for uniformity. Now, the Act of Uniformity basically sets out how all churches should appear and how services should be conducted. The B in rubs stands for the Book of Common Prayer. This was introduced, a set of new church services to be used in all churches. And then finally, the S is for supremacy. Elizabeth is the supreme governor of the Church of England, and all members of the church have to swear an oath of allegiance to her. So rubs, royal injunctions, uniformity, Book of Common Prayer, supremacy. And these are the four important bits. The royal injunctions set out laws and responsibilities of the people in the clergy. Uniformity sets out how churches should appear and what services look like. A Book of Common Prayer was a set of new church services to be used in all churches, and supremacy is an oath of allegiance needed to be paid to the supreme governor of the Church of England, who is Elizabeth. Now, if you were to sit there and say, how successful was this religious settlement? Well, out of the 10,000 clergy members, the members of church, 8,000 accept the religious settlement, which is actually quite, I would sit there and say, if you've got 80% of the clergy on side with this, then that is something quite impressive. There was always going to be some people who didn't like aspects. And, common sense. Act of uniformity, talking about the appearance of the churches, well, some people are not going to like it. Some people are going to like it. Okay, they're going to be annoyed, small things like the royal injunction stating an English Bible has to be in churches. That's going to annoy the Catholics because they believe services should be in Latin. So let's have a look at where the challenges lie for this religious settlement. We're going to start with the Puritans, and you remember I've already sat there and said to you that the Puritans are very strict Protestants. They do not like any decoration. They do not like having any specific roles or anything unnecessary that keeps them from practicing their religion and being close to God. So the Puritan challenge is very small, and they didn't like some parts of the religious settlement, in particular parts of the Act of Uniformity. Now, the uniformity part of the religious settlement, which sets out how churches should look, was a way to try and keep, Catholics happy. So the Puritans were like, well, we don't like the idea that we have to display crucifixes in our churches. Okay, this is something Elizabeth had added to help keep the Catholics on side. In short, Elizabeth does back down. Okay, so the crucifix controversy, she backs down over that and basically says, fine, you don't have to put crucifixes up because Puritans believe in no decoration in churches. Okay, guys, keep liking and sharing for me. There was also the vestment controversy. Now, vestments are special clothing that are worn by members of the church. And again, this was another thing the Puritans did not like. Why are we having to wear vestments? Okay, and this resulted in 1566, 37 Puritan priests resigned after refusing to wear new vestments when ordered. Again, it's more of a thing that they see it as more of a Catholic thing, okay, having to have the vestments. So there is some challenges to the uniformity side. And if you've just sort of popped your head in and thought, what am I talking about? We're looking at the religious settlement. Okay, so let's one last recap. You should all be sitting there thinking, rubs, royal injunction, uniformity, Book of Common Prayer, supremacy. Obviously, majority of the Protestants, apart from a small handful of Puritans, are going to be happy with it because, a lot of it established the Church of England's authority. The Act of Supremacy enforced Elizabeth as the governor of the Church of England. They believed that services and Bibles were more accessible, like Protestants would have wanted. Out of the... there was this, again, obviously Catholics that didn't like aspects of it. And we'll have a look at that from two different sides. We've obviously got why did the Catholics not like the religious settlement at home, but also what was the view of it abroad. Thank you very much for the gift there. So the Catholic challenge at home. 1/3 of English nobility, so they are your wealthy landowners, and the gentry, your sort of upper class, they live in the north and west of England. A lot of Catholics are very wealthy people, and they basically, in protest to the religious settlement, declared themselves recusants, which basically says they will not be attending, the church, because they didn't agree with the settlement. Now, in all fairness, there are parts of the settlement that Catholics are not going to like. They're not going to like some of the royal injunctions. For example, Book of Common, having a Bible translated in English. That was something that Catholics didn't want. Being told, well, they're going to hate the Act of Supremacy. If you're Catholic, the Act of Supremacy is saying all members of church have to accept that Elizabeth is the supreme head of the Church of England. That's not going to go down very well with Catholics at all. So there were certainly some things. Now, Elizabeth had tried to keep the Catholics happy with the uniformity, things like the crucifix, the vestments. There were things in place to try and keep Catholics happy, but a lot of the wealthy, powerful Catholics decided that they were not going to attend church because they did not agree with this. To make things even worse, the Pope was quite critical of Elizabeth, wasn't her biggest fan, and anytime there was any sense of opportunity to encourage Catholics or support Catholics, the Pope would do it. The Pope's head of the Catholic Church in the Vatican City, and quite enjoyed the fact that there was nothing really Elizabeth could do about that. And it is part of the reason we start to see the revolt of the Northern Earls, which I'll talk about in a bit. There is a wider issue with Elizabeth's religious settlement. Because she's Protestant, England starts to stand out, probably given the fact that across Europe, there had been a massive push on the Counter-Reformation to undo all the Protestant changes. Okay? And this was happening in England under Elizabeth's half-sister Mary. Okay, the eldest daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She was a Catholic. She was brought up a Catholic. She had been part of this massive Counter-Reformation. This comes to a halt with Elizabeth in England, being a Protestant, and it causes a lot of tension with other Catholic countries and the Pope. Okay? And we're going to talk about the excommunication in a bit, that the Pope, the Papal Bull, when we talk about the revolt of the Northern Earls. On top of the religious settlement, when you've got Catholics, especially up in the north, who don't like what they're seeing, they don't like the religious settlement, they're going to start turning, okay? They are going to start to look at alternatives, and they do believe that they have got one. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots, is an interesting character, okay? You probably are aware of Mary, Queen of Scots. She's a big character, and she is giving Catholics a sense of hope that there's a better alternative. I'm not going to go through the family tree, but technically she's second cousin to Elizabeth. She is Catholic, and therefore the English Catholics like her. Unfortunately for Mary, Queen of Scots, it's not been the most relaxing life that she's had. Okay. In short, Mary had obviously come to Scotland after her first husband, Francis II of France, dies. So she comes back to Scotland and marries someone called Lord Darnley. But after a very unhappy marriage, Darnley basically turns to a drunk. And we also, see, or supposedly he was part of murdering Mary, Queen of Scots' secretary at the time. Now, after this, there is a bit of a sort of trigger. because Mary Queen of Scots' husband, conveniently, rest in peace, 1567, dies. And who gets pointed to as a possible individual who may have killed her own husband? Mary. And that meant Mary was forced to exile from Scotland alongside James, okay, who was her son. And we also know that this isn't great at all, because where's she going to go? Scotland was Catholic, but because of her being accused of murdering her husband, she has to flee into England. Now, this is not great, because as soon as Mary comes into England, Elizabeth's life has just got a lot more complicated. Okay, it gives people an alternative. Elizabeth's got three options, basically, with Mary, Queen of Scots. When she comes over from Scotland, does she kick her out of the country, imprison her, or execute her? Well, if you get Mary out of the country, where are you going to send her? Okay, if you send her abroad to somewhere like France or back to Scotland, she might be able to build up a support system. If she imprisons Mary, it reduces that threat. But there could be revolts or rebellion in protest of her being imprisoned. And if you execute her, this could provoke a massive international attack from a lot of Catholic countries. So this becomes sort of a huge issue for her in terms of what to do with Mary. And let's look at the different reasons why Mary is a bit of a problem. Mary is technically linked to Mary is technically linked to all of the revolts and the rebellions that happened to Elizabeth. Nice little revision technique, guys. Not really that bothered. Nice, easy way to remember them. Northern Earls, Ridolfi Plot, Throckmorton, Babington. Not really that bothered, and they go in chronological order. So Northern Earls, Ridolfi, Throckmorton, Babington. Not really that bothered. One last time. Northern Earls, Ridolfi, Throckmorton, Babington. So, let's have a look at why do the Northern Earls revolt. Well, we've seen a bit of why they do. They want the country to be Catholic again. They're very unhappy with the religious settlement, and a lot of these wealthy Catholic nobles who have got lots of land basically saw their position in society taken away. They didn't have as much power. Elizabeth created, or put important people as part of her court. The William Cecils, the Robert Dudleys. It was a changing of the guard. So a lot of them were upset with the interferences that Elizabeth had from London. And a lot of them see Mary, Queen of Scots, being exiled into England as an opportunity. Okay, the idea could be is, why don't we get Mary, Queen of Scots, to marry Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, get rid of Elizabeth, and Mary can be queen. That's the grand plan. Okay. So what happens? The rebels are led from the Earls of Westmoreland and Northumberland, and they start marching their way to the city of Durham. They've got around 4,500 men. They storm in the cathedral, they destroy the English Bible and a Protestant communion table out of protest, and then decided to have a Catholic Mass, something that had been banned under the religious settlement. They were going to continue south. However, there wasn't really a plan. The Earls of Westmoreland and Northumberland, it was like, yeah, we'll gather forces and we'll march. But they knew what they wanted, but they didn't really know how they're going to achieve it.
No, I don't know if I have,
return, Elizabeth has a very, very swift reaction to these rebels. Okay, Elizabeth basically reacts to it very quickly. And when a lot of those rebels heard that Elizabeth was marching north, Most of the rebels retreated. A lot of them just sort of were like, yeah, okay, we're going. Anyone who was caught or imprisoned, about 800 rebels were executed as a warning to other potential rebels. Okay? And, I mean, as ultimately, it's very easy for Elizabeth to put down. It showed that decisive leadership. Now, why does the revolt of Northern Elves? Yes, there was a lack of a plan, but there was a lack of foreign support. The Earls of Westmoreland and Northumberland were under the impression that support would arrive from Spain. Okay, Spain is going to be something. Spain's going to pop up several times. That never happens. Elizabeth was a lot more popular than people, I think, the Catholics gave her credit for. A lot of the northern landowners actually stayed loyal to Elizabeth. I told you, 8,000 out of the 10,000 clergy members supported the religious settlement. There's not that much.
Yeah, well, it's been on for 2 hours.
It's not as big as they thought. A lot of people stayed loyal, or at least sat there and decided, yeah, this is not a great idea. And ultimately, Elizabeth was quick, decisive, sent troops up, clear warning, whereas the rebels, led by the Earls of Westmoreland and Northumberland, didn't really think this through at all. It was very much all they did is they marched out, bit of destruction in Durham Cathedral, but there was no plan really in place. The Earls, when they found out about this, quickly fled to Scotland. Westmoreland, he's lucky to escape. Okay, whereas Northumberland was captured and handed back to the English in 1572 when he tried to sneak over. Scotland caught him. And a lot of their power was taken away, land was confiscated. So Westmoreland was fortunate, Northumberland not so much. But what do we learn about this? Well, we learn first of all that Mary Queen of Scots is going to be a bit of a pain for Elizabeth. Keep liking and sharing, people. Come on.
And let's just remind ourselves, for all Liverpool fans,
we've also got the fact that it led to the Papal Bull. The Papal Bull, okay, is when
we are back on our perch,
the Pope excommunicates Elizabeth in 1570 after the revolt of the Norman Elves. Revolt of the Norman Elves, sorry. Okay, 1570, the Papal Bull, the Pope excommunicates Elizabeth. That basically
What would you do if you just suddenly saw Chris on
Catholics now have no
TV?
loyalty to Elizabeth whatsoever because the Pope has declared it.
Oh, Chris.
And this
I've attended the game.
Is very, I'd say, very troublesome. The reason it's very troublesome is because now it gives the Catholics incentives. So if you want to try your luck, the Pope is almost actively backing you. You have no right to have to sit there and listen to Elizabeth. So there are 3 plots that you need to know about. And if you've just joined us, not really that bothered. Northern Earls, Ridolfi, Throckmorton, Babington. Let's talk about the Ridolfi plot. Okay, the Ridolfi plot happens very quickly after the Papal Bull, where there's probably Elizabeth being quite vulnerable, and it's named after an Italian banker. Now, the Italian banker Ridolfi was basically spying for the Pope and trying to sort out a marriage between Mary Queen of Scots and the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard. Okay? This is very similar to the revolt of the Northern Earls, but there was actually a planned murder in place. Now, Ridolfi not just has support from the Pope, but also discusses the plot with Philip II of Spain. And he says,
Bit late now.
we will, he instructs one of his sort of best commanders, the Duke of Alba, to get 10,000 troops ready to invade, to support Ridolfi. It was very quickly discovered, or like sort of it falls apart.
What lessons do we actually have then tomorrow if we don't have
advisors
photography?
and one of the trusted for Elizabeth, William Cecil, discovers the plot
First lesson.
And when this plot is discovered,
And
the Duke of Norfolk
This,
got
I
out
think.
his tried for treason and executed because
Yeah, first and
he
fifth.
tried to overthrow Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think
Elizabeth
yeah, but I
doesn't
don't have that.
want to murder
You don't
Mary,
have that.
Queen of Scots,
No.
and get her executed. Probably
It's
because of the
assembly.
reasons we discussed. She's wary of the
Oh, wait.
ramifications that that will lead to. Okay, now, ultimately, it shows that there is not just people within the country that are planning to overthrow. There is a link, always links back to the Pope, always links back to Spain. Okay, it's that constant, who do you trust? The Throckmorton plot, okay, is named after the young English Catholic Francis Throckmorton. Okay, and basically, the whole point was Francis Throckmorton was working alongside, or sort of basically passing letters between the French and Mary, Queen of Scots. This time it was the French, who were also Catholic. The Duke of Guise wanted to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, make England Catholic. And who supports that? The Pope's going to support it. Philip II of Spain's going to support it. And Throckmorton is basically a young English Catholic who is passing letters, okay, between them. Now, Francis Walsingham, we'll talk about him in a bit more, but his role as Secretary of State, or as we know him, the Spy Master, plays a really important role here. Because what he does is he discovers this plot, okay? And while discovering this plot, Throckmorton is clearly executed. While they actually went through Throckmorton's property, they found lots of names of Catholics who had been plotting or writing, and there was now an intense persecution of Catholics. 11,000 were imprisoned or kept under house arrest following the Throckmorton plot. So Walsingham had managed to intercept a whole list of names of English Catholics who could be a danger to Elizabeth. There is one thing missing from it, that in these letters that they intercepted from Throckmorton, there was no straight, direct piece of evidence linking Mary, Queen of Scots. However, Mary was moved, okay, to a different location and was guarded now by a very strict Puritan following the Throckmorton plot. Now, Francis Walsingham doesn't just disappear and think, okay, we've done our best. He basically is now wanting to seize that opportunity. He wants to get that guilty evidence that he can present to Elizabeth, saying what Mary, Queen of Scots plans to do. So Walsingham now wants to get that proof, and it comes in the form of the Babington plot. Now, the Babington plot, okay, is again another young English Catholic, Anthony Babington, okay, wants to try and assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. It's, to be honest, very similar in what they wanted to do. Okay, however, this time Francis Walsingham and his spy network are waiting. And they managed to intercept the letters. Okay, and when Walsingham spies intercept letters, they find these coded letters between Babington and Mary, offering to kill Elizabeth and keep her informed of the progress of the plot. Mary had replied to these letters, providing acknowledgement. And now Francis Walsingham has what he needs to give to Elizabeth and say, that's it. Okay, we finally got her. We finally got that involvement. And that leads, obviously, to Babington's arrested. He tortures. He's executed. And Mary, Queen of Scots now has finally been caught as part of this process. So, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots happens after Elizabeth signs Mary's death warrant in February 1987. So, let's just quickly, before we go, it's important that if you don't know already, guys, I would love to get to 100,000 likes. You superstars will get me there. I know already that if you haven't, knowing who Francis Walsingham is really important. Okay, as the Secretary of State, he was known as the spy master. He basically had spies and informants. Spies are people who collect information, obviously in secret. Informants are people that would probably just pass information to him or dub other people in. And he has such, his network that he had, I think his spy network had been in place for about 15 years. And he wasn't just in England, he has these spies popping up abroad as well. He was very clever in the way that he used ciphers, okay, a form of coding in his correspondence. And then when he would arrest people, he would be known to use torture and execution to stop people from committing crimes against Elizabeth in the future. So he's really important. Now, Mary Queen of Scots being executed, we know probably why, because the short term is Walsingham's provided evidence, but she's also been part of all the plots. The revolt of the Northern Earls, Ridolfi, Throckmorton and Babington. There is one key thing here. What was the goal? The goal was to get Elizabeth off the throne and put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne, and she's the one common thing in there. Another reason why they wanted to execute is because there had been constant links to Spanish support. The Spanish were even planning, during the Ridolfi plot, to send 10,000 troops in. The revolt of the Northern Earls, they believed the Spanish were going to send support in. So all the way through, there was this threat to England's security. And all the time that she was alive, there was this constant alternative for the Catholics. So, initially, after the Babington plot, she does get put on trial. Elizabeth, though, thank you very much, Paige, signs her death warrant in February 1587. Elizabeth was very reluctant to do so. Not just because of the Catholic-Protestant divide, but she's also a relative and was actually quite upset about the execution itself. But it was something that ended up needing to be happened. Now, how did people respond? What was the response to this execution? Let's go to France. Well, actually, no. Let's start with Spain. Spain are already having major disputes with England, and we'll look at that. And to be honest, it was just one of many problems the English and Spanish had with each other. In Scotland, despite the fact that Mary Queen of Scots had come from Scotland, King James VI of Scotland does absolutely nothing. Why? Because, spoiler alert, Elizabeth has no heir. So that same King James VI of Scotland is going to become the King of England if it remains the same. So, to be honest, he probably doesn't want to do anything that's going to ruin his chances. Most English Catholics remain loyal to Elizabeth. They may not have liked it, but we've already said the problem with the revolt of the Northern Earls previously was not as many of them wanted to rebel as they probably thought. Now, there is some alliances that come out of this. France are quite eager to maintain an alliance with England, more on the fact that they fear the power of Spain. So actually, there is, following Mary Queen of Scots, there is an alliance. They don't, even though France is Catholic and England's Protestant, France don't want to upset having an alliance with England because they are cautious of the power Spain have. And that's why we need to look at the relationships specifically with Spain, and it can be split into three parts, this. I want you to think about the relationship between England and Spain: religious, political, economic / commercial. So commercial could be economic, but let's start with religion. Real easy. England's Protestant, Spain is Catholic. They see each other as a threat. Philip II of Spain had previously been married to Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, and they had also... He had had marriage proposals turned down by Elizabeth, so I reckon he probably didn't go over that. But really simple, two different religions. And we know that religious motivation meant that Philip II, behind the scenes, had been supportive of a lot of the Catholic plots. There is also a political rivalry going on. And we're going to focus on the Netherlands. The Netherlands were facing constant issues with Spain. Spain basically were flexing their muscles across Europe. And Netherlands came under constant persecution from Spain. And there was a lot of people that said, well, look, Elizabeth, you've got an opportunity to support the Protestants that are in the Netherlands. So Elizabeth, behind the scenes, was basically playing a political game. She was secretly providing money and providing rebels to fight against the Spanish. But she was also encouraging, English sailors and explorers to go around and privateer and sort of attack Spanish colonies, rob Spanish ships. So this is all going behind the scene. So what's this got to do? Why has this caused a problem? Well, because the people, such as Francis Drake and co, were going around robbing gold and silver from Spanish ships, Spain actually start to struggle to pay their soldiers in the Netherlands. Okay, and it's called the Spanish Fury. And this is where you have unpaid Spanish troops who finally start looting and they robbing the Dutch town of Antwerp. And this caused a lot of anger in the Netherlands. Basically, the 17 Dutch provinces joined together against the Spanish. They've had enough. Okay, it doesn't matter who, the Netherlands stands strong. The 17 provinces get together and it's known as the Pacification of Ghent. And then basically the Netherlands want Spain to leave. Now they don't leave, but because the Spanish were not being paid because of the English privateers, there's now an increased level of tension between Spain and the Netherlands. Now, even though Elizabeth at this point hadn't publicly declared support for the Netherlands, there was a lot of anger from Spain about what the English were doing. There is also this economic rivalry. Both of them are countries that want to expand their influence. They want more trade, they want more resources. From 1492 onwards, we have the era of the New World, where we find places such as Turkey, China, Russia, North Africa, and a lot of European countries were going out there and they were creating colonies. What the English traders hated is because of Spain's power, Spain had control of all trade routes at this time. And if you wanted to set up a trade route, you had to get permission from the Spanish. And this doesn't sit well with a lot of the English privateers. Okay, now considering Spain were used to sort of getting their own way with trade routes, the economic rivalry starts to develop big time. Because we know that Elizabeth was quite open and honest in supporting English privateers. Now, if we're sort of talking about privateers, if we're going legally, what they do is wrong. They go around stealing, looting and making money. But because they bring the money back and makes England wealthier, Elizabeth and other rich nobles used to give large amounts of money, to your Francis Drakes of the world. They're basically giving the Francis Drakes of the world lots of money so they can go around and raid Spanish colonies, so different lands that the Spanish have got, and ships. And very famously, between 1577 and 1580, around the time that Sir Francis Drake was circumnavigating around the globe, he captured around £400,000 worth of Spanish silver and gold. That is why, okay, and this is really important, that is why they couldn't start paying the Spanish troops in the Netherlands. And this is a really bad... Now, what the Spanish are saying, and the anger is, hang on a minute, these privateers are going around stealing our gold and silver. Now, but Elizabeth is publicly supporting them. Francis Drake famously got knighted by Elizabeth. And again, this angered. So there's a religious divide, there's a political divide, there's an economic divide. Okay, and the two countries now, the tension is starting to spill over. The war with Spain, okay, is quite... I mean, it all comes to a head, you know. So, we're going to go like... I mean, it was always... I think it was always inevitable, but it was sort of just... what's the best way to describe it? There needs to be... there needs to be that spark. So there's lots of tension building up, whether it's over the secret support Elizabeth is giving the Protestants in Netherlands, whether it's the privateering and the stealing of Spanish gold and money, whether it's Spain trying to get involved in the plots against Elizabeth. But there needs to be that sort of one action that can set off this war. So, we're going to go and have a look at 1585, key date, okay? 1585. 1585 is important because it's when Elizabeth and England officially sign a treaty with the rebels in the Netherlands. It's called the Treaty of Nonsuch. Why do we need to know this? This is because this is a treaty where England are declaring their support for the Netherlands. England are basically saying, we will give you 7,000, pay for 7,400 soldiers led by Robert Dudley to fight with you against the Spanish. This gives King Philip II his moment because he's like, right, I can officially declare war on England. You know, he knew England were actively involved, but there was no public declaration. So the 1585 Treaty of Nonsuch is the justification, that spark needed for the Philip II of Spain to get his armada, his navy, to attack England. Now, the armada being sent sort of comes down to, I mean, there's ultimately like a lot of things really it's all boiled up to, and I just want to recap them. We know there are religious differences. King Philip II, I don't think he was ever over the rejection, the marriage rejection. We know that English sailors had been stealing money from the Spanish. France, momentarily, are also in a civil war, which means that Spain feel it's a good time to attack England because there's going to be no French. I mean, the French basically don't like either of them, but they believed if the French are preoccupied, there's no risk that the French are going to join in. We already know that the Spanish had always had an interest in the Catholic plots. We know that Elizabeth had officially declared to support the Dutch rebels. There are loads of reasons why it actually happens. But was it going to go to plan? Well, there is one more plot twist. In 1587, Francis Drake, who, as we know, is quite a big name for his stealing and looting, decides to attack the Spanish Navy when they were stationed in the port of Cadiz. Okay, Elizabeth told him to do this. 30 ships and supplies were destroyed. This is known as the singeing of the King of Spain's beard, because Spain now have to take a whole year to rebuild their fleet. So it's not until 1588 where Philip is able to get the armada of 130 ships to sail across the Netherlands and then up to England to attack. I'm just gonna. I mean, I feel like let's talk about how the two sides looked during the Armada. Okay. On paper, okay, is England have Francis Drake and John Hawkins as their main experienced leaders, whereas the Spanish have the Duke of Medina Sidonia and the Duke of Alba, who have little experience. England have more ships, but they are lighter and they are faster. The Spanish have larger ships. They have less ships altogether, but they have the massive galleon ships. Spain have more men. They have 30,000 men on board and 20,000 soldiers on land. And while England only have nearly less than half of that men on board in their navy. The food supplies, Spain are going to struggle to get food supplies. Whereas England, because the Spanish are coming over to England, okay, it meant that it was much easier to keep the English food supplies up. Weapons. The Spain go for the large cannons. Okay, 2,000 massive large cannons. They were more powerful. Okay, but they were slower to load and they had to have a shorter distance. So ships had to get very close to be able to fire them. England go for less but smaller cannons, which can reload quicker and fire over a greater distance. The income from Spain was they put 3 million equivalent into what they needed. Okay, the income needed for their soldiers versus only 300,000 that could be given to the English fighters, even though Parliament did provide some further taxes to keep this going up. When we look at why Spain lost, there are some key issues. First of all, let's talk about the leaders. Okay? The Duke of Parma and the Duke of Medina, not only did they have a lack of experience in what they did, but they did not communicate effectively. Okay? And this was clear. They're going up against the likes of Francis Drake. Well, we're forgetting that Francis Drake, it wasn't that long ago where he circumnavigated the globe. So there was a clear difference in skills between the leaders. The planning was another key bit. So the Spanish ships would come in a crescent formation. So when you think about a crescent moon, a crescent formation. But unfortunately, they didn't have a backup plan. So when Francis Drake used the fire ships at the Battle of Gravelines, and this is where they sent an empty ship, set it on fire, and launched it into this crescent. Now this crescent formation, suddenly, to get away, they have to cut the anchors and they find themselves drifting away. So the planning was actually, what's plan B? They didn't know how to deal with the fire ship tactics. No reinforcements. The Spanish had planned to pick up the Duke of Parma's army en route from the Netherlands, but they were never able to do it. So they couldn't get nearly as many men as they had initially planned to get. The tactics work in the English favour. English could fire their smaller cannons from a further distance. The Spanish had to get up close to be able to use their cannons. And because of this, and the fact that these cannons that the English had could reload quicker, meant that they were more effective. And then finally, let's not forget about the classic winds, or as some people call it, the Protestant winds. As there was no port for the Spanish ships to sort of go and dock in, it meant that the Spanish ships took an absolute battering from the winds. Now the winds were sort of, they call them Protestant winds because there was a belief at the time that God was intervening and that God was on Elizabeth's side. So all of these play a massive part. And I mean, why is it important we know, and what are the consequences of this? Because, well, first of all, we can't say... I mean, I think the English, might have had better tactics, but only one Spanish ship is sunk from gunfire. Most of the Spanish ships take an absolute beating from the bad weather. Okay, this is not the last time that Spain are at war with England. Okay, but the English put a marker down. They basically have defeated the country who have sort of like led the way with trading and access routes, and the reputation of Elizabeth goes up. The reputation of England as a sea power massively increases as a result of this. So, behind all of that, we need to look at society and the age of exploration, because we've done sort of like the political, the rebellions, we've done religion, we've done the problems of Spain. Elizabethan society goes through an awful lot of change, and I'm going to start with education. Now, education, there is no compulsory schooling in Elizabethan England. Most children have their lives, they sort of they revolve around their family. However, there is a greater access to books, thanks to the printing press. And there was some changes to education that played a huge part during this time. Because the ability to read and write becomes more desirable, and this is because of the various different jobs. For example, if you want to become a merchant and be a wealthy person who takes part in trading with other countries, you being able to read and write is quite an important thing. So, very few go to school. Only 15 to 20% of the population can read and write, but the change in growth and the increase of being a Protestant country, where they're saying, look, you need to read church services, they're in English. So the printing press had made books cheaper. Trade, development in the country, and the fact they were now Protestant meant there was greater need for it. So what do we see change? First of all, you've got your parish schools that would teach basic literacy to children of the yeomen and craftsmen. Remember on that first slide when I said you've got to know your different social statuses. The yeomen and the craftsmen are your middle class groups of people, which is good, because the only people, when we talk about the 15 to 20%, would have been your rich, landowning, wealthy people. Grammar schools started being set up for 10 to 14-year-olds. They did involve fee paying, so predominantly rich families, but some scholarships for boys. Petty schools were basically what they would go to up to the age of 10, and then they would go to grammar schools afterwards. There was more of an emphasis on universities. Okay, you've got Oxford and Cambridge. However, there was now an area of London called the Inns Court where people were starting to be trained as lawyers. And finally, if you had private tutors, which if girls wanted to get any form of education, it would have to be through a private tutor. Usually you come from richer families. So ultimately what we've learned here is education it's not like a massive change, but there is some greater access, especially to those middle class yeoman and craftsman families. Sports and pastimes are really straightforward. Okay, I don't think I need to explain them for you. Obviously it depends on, I'm trying to think, if there any you need to know about. Hawking, okay, is quite straightforward. Hawk being a bird of prey and being able to go, call it, hunt and call it back again. Very, very, very good to watch. But no, I think most of that's pretty straightforward. I don't think I need to really go through the sports and pastimes with you. I will, however, talk about theatre. Now, theatre is a huge change, and I think it's important we understand why. When we talk about culture during the Elizabethan periods, a lot of people call it the golden age of culture, and that is because it's a time of great plays. People like William Shakespeare writing plays that were meant to be performed. And this is why we see the development of purpose-built theatres. And these offered different tiers of seating, where you would have different prices, and it was probably the one place, okay, where people could, from all social classes, could come. So you obviously had the pit, where sort of your lower classes would come. You would have like your royal boxes and higher tiered seating for the rich people. Now, theatre is not just because of the custom-built theatres like the Globe and like the Rose, but because of the new plays being written, and because of these performances, being an actor in theatre actually becomes a proper job. And what this means, and I'll give you an example, is a lot of wealthy patrons, okay, and patrons are basically someone who's got lots of money. And the Queen herself, Elizabeth, took part in this. What they would do is they would sponsor groups of professional actors. So they would basically pay them. In the past, groups of actors had sort of just gone by a town and city and done like a little pop-up. But now, because of the demand and popularity of theatre, wealthy people are starting to sponsor them, and therefore they become professional. So, for example, the Earl of Leicester became a patron for the Leicester's Men's Theatre Group. So that, again, is a massive change. Did everyone like theatre? You believe it? No. There were people in the positions of authority that did not like it, because actually it drew in people from all social statuses, and basically they did not want, for example, your rogues, your vagabonds, your beggars coming around breaking the law. And believe it or not, the Puritans, the really strict Protestants, had a problem with it. They believed it was the work of the devil if you happened to be a professional actor, and it encouraged poor moral behaviour. Now, one of the biggest things we need to know, guys, do you reckon we get to 100,000 likes? I think we need one last final push from you lot. Now, one last thing we've got to understand is the poverty and the poor laws in England. Okay? Let's talk about why there is an increase in poverty. Okay? The increase in poverty comes from several different things. First of all, a natural population growth happening. So 1551, which is a few years, it was at 3 million, 1601, at the end of the Elizabethan period, 4.2 million. And when there's an increase in population, there is a greater demand for food, for housing, for land. There are also several poor harvests. You don't need to know every single poor harvest year, but if there's less harvest, if there's a poor harvest, there is less food supplies. And therefore, it's the food that is around costs a lot more money. One of the biggest changes to farming was the introduction of enclosures. Previously, a lot of land could be rented out, it could be public owned land. Enclosures is where you start to see people actually, fencing off their own private land. And therefore, there was a lot of people who previously under the feudal system, medieval feudal system, peasants at least had an area of land which they could rent off. Enclosures meant that they now no longer had a place. They no longer had a place of work, leading to the formation of vagabonds or vagrants. Vagabonds are basically people who they're called like wandering beggars. They would go round looking for ways to get money, but they caused a lot of concern for the social order in society. It was also very difficult for everyone to earn enough money. More people were progressively getting poorer. Thank you very much for the rose. Okay, especially given the fact that there were trade embargoes where countries like Spain, because of the war they were having with England, were not trading. Things became a lot more difficult. Therefore, you start to see higher unemployment during this time. So we need to understand what Elizabeth planned to do about this. So there is a fear around England that with the increased problem, if you let more and more people become poor, the social order may fall apart. Vagabonds and beggars, could possibly start turning to crime. There was also ideas that the more people that are poor, more disease will spread. There was also landowners who were like, thank you very much for the roses. If Elizabeth doesn't do anything, or her government doesn't do anything, it will be us wealthy landowners who have to give out more. So what actions were taken? Well, first of all, the Justices of Peace, who were sort of like the local officials at the time, they basically were allowed to go around and collect taxes to help the poor and unemployed. Okay? And what they did is they divided people up into two groups. Okay? You had the impotent poor, or what we call the deserving poor. Now, when I say impotent poor / deserving poor, I'm talking about the people who couldn't help themselves. They might not be able to work, due to age. They might not be able to work due to disability. And this is something that is out of their hands. The other group were known as the idle poor or the able-bodied poor. That these are people who could work but have decided not to. They've decided to become vagrants or beggars or vagabonds. Okay? And the first thing that was put into place to deal with them was the 1572 Vagabonds Act. Under the 1572 Vagabonds Act, they would take actions against these people. They could be whipped, bored through the ear, put to death if they were caught begging. And it was a way to try and clamp down on this issue. Now, the other group, the deserving poor, or the impotent poor, depends what you know them as. Things did get put in places. For example, Poor Relief Act started to collect money on local levels in 1576, and people could be punished if they did not refuse to pay a poor rate. Now, what are poor rates? Poor rates are basically what we'd call a tax. For example, we pay a national, people who work full-time, like myself, we pay national insurance contributions, and that money is then put into, for example, the National Health Service. These poor rates were a tax that people had to pay, and it would then provide support for the impotent and deserving poor who were unable to work. Now, probably the most famous law that got introduced was the 1601 Poor Law. The 1601 Poor Law had 4 key bits to it. Thank you very much, Cameron. At 1601, it was no longer a poor relief done on a local level. By 1601, it was a national law that there had to be a poor rate. Everyone had to pay into the system. Everyone had to pay into the system. It wasn't just down to locals like it had been previously. So you see that 1576 Poor Relief Act, that was a local one. In 1601, they all have to do it. The whole country has to do it. If you refused to pay your poor rate, you could be sent to jail. The 1601 Poor Law also banned begging, and anyone caught would be sent back to their place of birth. And it was almost like a free strike system. If you did it third time, you could be sentenced to death. They also set up almhouses. Almhouses was an area for people where they were looked after if they were unable to work. So 1601 is when the poor law becomes a national law. Everyone in the country has to be contributing to supporting those deserving / impotent poor, but also clamping and banning down on those idle, able-bodied poor. The Age of Exploration. This will be quite straightforward for a lot of us, okay? Because there are 3 key characters that we need to know. One of them we've talked about quite a lot, okay? Exploration during the Elizabethan Age is massive. It's massive for several reasons. Trade routes have started to develop because of the New World. People are finding new products. They find new opportunities for colonies. Ships, as we know from what we were talking about, the battle with the Spanish, had become better. Sails were bigger. They were faster. We had the development of quadrants, astroblades making it faster, more direct. And a lot of people became adventurous because it was high risk but high reward. Now, if you were a privateer and you decided to go exploring, there are obviously huge risks. Not everyone is a Francis Drake, and Francis Drake famously circumnavigated the globe December 1577 to 1580, and his reputation helped enhance England as a seafaring nation, even though we know that during that time he already stole £400,000 worth of gold and silver from the Spanish ships. Francis Drake, real simple, was a big name. Because there's 2 things you need to know about him: his circumnavigation, and what I've already mentioned was the singeing of the King of Spain's beard in 1587 by delaying the Armada preparations. Okay? He had a massive impact. He was responsible for bringing back and making a lot of money for England through the robbing of the Spanish Empire and ships. He also reclaimed a lot of new lands. He built trading contacts, and because of this, he was knighted by Elizabeth. Another person we have mentioned earlier was John Hawkins. Okay, John Hawkins was also someone who was Sir Francis Drake's cousin. He was developing and spent a lot of time building and developing better galleon ships for the British. He made a lot of his money through voyages linked to the slave trade. Okay, right the way through the early sort of 1560s of Elizabeth's reign, John Hawkins was capturing people from African countries and selling them to Central America. He came back after being part of the being part of the slave trade. He returns and he's made vice admiral of this during the battle of the battle against the Spanish Armada alongside Francis Drake. Now, in all fairness, why are we talking about John Hawkins? Well, you can't rule out the fact that a lot of those ships, they're faster, lighter, they could deal with better weather. His innovative designs were a key essential part in that Armada victory. And the final one is Walter Raleigh. And Walter Raleigh is linked to the lost colony. So the colonisation of Virginia is quite an interesting one, because Sir Walter Raleigh puts together an expedition team. He raises the money for it, but he does not travel with them. Okay? Now, he was, he was a sailor, he was an explorer, and he basically in 1584 had got a permission from the Queen, a royal charter, to be able to go off and establish a colony, on Roanoke Island. And he does this with 2 expeditions to take settlers to the colony. Now, these two expeditions involved 107 different colonists, largely soldiers and sailors, and there were a few craftsmen and farmers too, led by Richard Granville, and they went up to the sort of Roanoke Island near Virginia. Now, the first group came home after 1 year, and then the second one famously went up. So they sort of switched it up. The second expedition disappear, and we don't have a clue what happened to them. Now, there are some suggestions. The failure of the colonisation of the Roanoke Islands in Virginia, there was a lack of food. So people who were on the expedition, they arrived too late, they were unable to plant crops. There was poor leadership. Walter Raleigh, who raised the money for the expeditions, and the person who actually led them, Richard Grenville, did not get on. They lacked useful people. People like stonemasons or men to do physical work. They had all of these soldiers, okay, and all these sailors, but actually lacked the craftsmen or the amount needed. But they also came under a lot of disliking from the Native Americans, because it was believed that the colonists, when they came over, were bringing a disease with them, and all of a sudden are coming to their land and saying, yeah, we need food. Okay, so the Roanoke Island gets given the nickname the Lost Colony, because people can't, no one knows what happened during that second expedition. Yeah, so was Raleigh is important, but who knows is the question, because that is up. I don't know. I do not know. But on a good note, people, that is that. And another topic bites the dust. So, oh, that's nice. So, guys, first of all, these Elizabeth notes are on my link tree. The link tree is below my TikTok bio, or it's in my Elizabeth playlist on TikTok, so you can save them when you need them. Go and check the schedule, which is I published today for the latest TikTok lessons that will be going out. But yeah, there we go. I think hopefully that covered a vast majority of stuff needed. I'm going to shoot off because I have got things to do, and while I enjoy your wonderful company, I will be seeing quite a lot of you over the next 3 weeks. So this is, I'm sure, thrilling for all of us. Right, thank you everyone for your continued support and the likes and the follows and some of you have been very generous with the roses, you heroes. And I will see some of you, I can't remember what I'm doing tomorrow, but I will see some of you tomorrow. Right. Keep it real, everybody.
Oh my god, there's a kid making a skybase. And he just died. Oh.
Is he in there? I hear footsteps though, man.
Oh my god, I'm done. I'm leaving. Flip this.
Oh my god.
Just as it is good, and you've got your tannin drops, and I do the sprays in plain